Tel Aviv does not look like a fortress. It's an attractive, cosmopolitan city where people can enjoy the pleasures of a Mediterranean life. But Tel Aviv is also the economic and cultural powerhouse of the nation that dominates the Middle East. From its very beginnings as a state for the world's Jews, Israel showed that it had the military might and military intelligence to keep its enemies at bay, with the help, of course, of rich and powerful friends. Jaffa, the Palestinian Arab city that Tel Aviv replaced, had been an economic and cultural center for the East Mediterranean for thousands of years. But the city, once known as the Bride of Palestine, is now a small suburb engulfed by Greater Tel Aviv and the might of the Jewish state. Tel Aviv today has a population of 400,000, with 2.5 million more in the surrounding urban metropolis. But modern Jaffa has just 50,000 people, and only 20,000 of them are Arabs. Jaffa, the Bride of Palestine, died as a city 60 years ago in a series of events that the Israelis call their War of Independence and the Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe. Most of the people of Jaffa fled during the final days of conflict between the Jewish militias and the much weaker Palestinian resistance. In that exodus, the city's population fell from an estimated 120,000 to fewer than 4,000. So in mid-May 1948, Ajami Street, the street we are calling Palestine Street, was deserted. And 60 years later, it still shows scars from that time. Of course, it also has traffic and shops and cafes and schools like anywhere else in a modern city. And it has a new Hebrew name, Yafet Street. In this film, I shall discover what has become of Ajami Street since the Nakba and the neighborhoods it runs through, and what has become of some of the people who have lived, worked, studied and played here. In Palestine Street, we are concentrating on a personal and intimate version of the events of 1948 and the time before and after. A description that reaches beyond political rhetoric and the history of the Middle East conflict.
Everybody else did something to do with fashion or...
We have chosen Ajami Street as our Palestine Street because it runs like a spine through Jaffa, just as it runs like a spine through the memory of the city. I'll meet people who remember Ajami Street, who lived most of their lives in refugee camps in Lebanon. And people who live in ostentatious villas in the Gulf.
And the Ajami neighborhood in the south. So this is the beginning of this.
And people who are fighting to keep Ajami Street and the rest of Jaffa alive, not simply as a storehouse of memory, nor just a busy street in suburban Tel Aviv, but as a vibrant place in modern Palestinian life. I discovered that the odds stacked against them are overwhelming, and that in many ways, the Nakba, the catastrophe, continues. When I used to come to Jaffa as a child from London, enjoying days out with a Palestinian branch of my family, this was the Jaffa I saw. This is the Jaffa Israelis see when they come to eat fish by the harbour. But in the minds of Palestinians, the old port of Jaffa is where most of the 120,000 or so who became refugees saw their city for the last time. One of the 4,000 who stayed in Jaffa when most of the population fled was Ismail Abu Shhadi. He remembers being a young man in the hours of chaos before the Israeli militias moved in to take complete control of the city.
يوم الكسرة يوم النكبة
The day of catastrophe in 1948. There was no security checkpoint before the Jews came in. So those who stayed behind in Jaffa actually looted the port. I stole some flour. People came and took flour, sugar, boxes of sardines, things like that. They looted the port until the Zionist militia came in. But close to nothing was left in the warehouses. The people looted first, and the soldiers took what was left.
The rest of the city was a dead zone, ripe for the picking.
The homes were empty. People would go into the homes and steal the furniture and take everything.
Like most of his family, Ismail had been ready to leave. It was his father who insisted that they should stay.
أبوي كان زلمة كبير وكنا نقول له يعني بدنا نهاجر نطلع زي الناس يقول لا.
My father was an old man, and we'd tell him we want to leave like everyone else, and he'd say, no, death is better than leaving. Everyone should die on their land and never quit. Emigration, he said, is too hard. The migrant's someone who's become nothing, even though he was once respectable in his own country.
Omar Siksik runs a hardware store on Ajami Street. He was born 10 years after the Nakba, but feels deep gratitude to those in his family who refused to be driven out.
My grandfather refused to leave. He said that if the others wanted to go, they could, but he was not going to. For me, this is the greatest thing that we achieved. That we were able to stay in our country, that we could hold on to our roots, even if the land was captured from us. Half the family who lived close to my grandfather ended up running away. Really, the whole family broke apart. They used to tell me about the harsh things that took place in Jaffa. The shootings, the killings, the fear and terror, how people fled.
In May 1948, Jaffa, like the other port cities of Palestine, Akka and Haifa, was in the hands of the new state of Israel. The Arabs left and the city awaited their fate. Omar's grandfather and Ismail's father had taken their families to the relative safety of the orange groves nearby, unsure what would happen next.
Everyone had a few acres of land, and we were in our farm under the trees. But when the Israelis came, they rounded us up from the farms and told us to go back into the town, open up a house and stay there. We got a house and moved in, like everyone else. After a while, my father started to scream and shout, saying, "The land has died, the farms have died." Eventually, we did get back to the farm. It was neglected, of course, but my father revived it.
For 18 months, Ismail and most of the 4,000 people left in Jaffa were housed behind barbed wire in the Ajami district, an area bound on its eastern side by Ajami Street and on the west by the sea. Here, the Israelis could keep Palestinians under close observation and tight control. Ismail's grandson, Sami Abu Shhadi, takes me to a high point of Ajami. Sami is an academic who has committed himself to keeping the memory of Jaffa alive. Today, the new apartment buildings that surround us, overlooking the Mediterranean, are some of the most expensive real estate in Tel Aviv. But back from the sea, Ajami still carries the taint of a place used as a dumping ground for the poor and dispossessed.
The whole neighborhood of Ajami was surrounded by a fence with soldiers and dogs and going all around. And the Jews, from their European experience, by the way, called the Ajami neighborhoods a ghetto.
Why?
because this was their historical experience in Europe, a place where you have a neighborhood for certain people, and you have a fence surrounding it with soldiers and dogs. It's called a ghetto. By the way, the Arabs used this term till the 1980s to call their neighborhood a ghetto without being aware to what did exactly ghetto mean.
Soon the Palestinians held in Ajami would be joined by people who had survived the ghettos of Europe, and much worse, the extermination camps built by the Nazis. These Jewish refugees were pouring into the new Israel by the hundreds of thousands, seeking a haven from centuries of persecution. Most of them arrived by ship, just as the people of Jaffa had left their homeland. The European Jews, along with others from North Africa, needed homes themselves. So the Israeli authorities started to commandeer the abandoned houses of Jaffa. Some of the people who'd been forced to live in Ajami were permanently denied access to their own homes.
I made interviews with Palestinians who went after the war to ask for a pillow or a small thing from their house or a picture or anything symbolic from their houses, to bring it with them to the Ajami neighborhood. And of course, the Jewish immigrants did not want to give them their own property. And you should imagine a man going to his house, his own house, asking to take something very small out of it. And he can't do it.
Then the knife twisted one more turn as more and more Jewish refugees arrived from East Europe and North Africa.
So they started dividing the same house of the Palestinian family, not the same building, it's the same house, and cut it into 3 or 4 rooms, give one room to the Bulgarian family and one to another Moroccan family, and having a kitchen and a bathroom with all these people together. Now you should imagine the people after the war and the catastrophe and losing everything, having to live with their enemy inside their houses, using the same kitchen, the same bathroom, the same living room for decades.